Down in Alabama, fall guaranteed you a few things. One was that it was still going to be humid, and you never knew when a thunderstorm would strike. Two, it meant that once you had made the rounds at what few houses were handing out candy that night, there was little else to do but get into trouble. That is what this story is about. When letting my true feelings take the driver's seat and running out of constructive things to do collide, it did not help that I was one of the less popular variety at school. Which, wearing a mask was relief from my regular torment. Those preteen hormones and small town life were a ticking time bomb if you had ever known one. What's the saying again? Idle hands are the devil's plaything. The saxophone president was busy yapping on the television, and my mother was buttering up my father in an attempt to sing Titanic on an opening weekend. I was busy working on my Halloween costume at the kitchen table and trying to tune the two of them out. When you grow up in a single-wide trailer in Podunk, Alabama, you tend not to have the funds for the fancier things in life, but I was tired as going as bedsheet ghost or hobo clown. I wanted to be scary. I wanted to be a real monster. I wanted to make Jeffrey Scott wet his pants in front of his dim-witted football jock friends. I wanted to be anything but the poor, miserable fat kid for one night. I just couldn't let my mom know that I was using her makeup. Few brown stitches in an old drop cloth, some old pine straw, a pair of overalls, and my dad's flannel shirt did not look like much on its own, but with the right amount of tweaking, it made for an interesting scarecrow. It was still missing something, however. My Pawpaw Mac had always been good for ideas, and he knew just the way to top off my getup. Literally. It took a bit of digging through his old tool shed. That place was a mess from front to back. Granny said she had no idea how he kept track of anything out there, but he managed to find the straw hat he was looking for. It was missing quite a few strands, and you could tell it had been a snack for a mouse or two, but it fit perfect. His trusty old-timer made a few jagged cuts in my pants, and he said with a wash or two it would look proper rugged. He told me if I got into trouble to just tell my parents it was his doing. They did not question him on anything. When the sun went down in that little town, I set out down the drive with my homemade costume, hand-me-down hat, and a potato sack my granny had rustled up for gathering my take for the night. The grin behind that ugly material would have been enough to scare anyone if they could have seen it. I was so excited I could barely contain it. I was bounding from door to door in no time. Some of the porch lights had not even clicked on yet. I waited eagerly for the late arrivals to retrieve their treats, belting out the command for candy with a trick-or-treat. My sack was half full within the first hour, but there was no way I was turning in early. This was one of the best days of the year, second only to Christmas, and even that could be disappointing when your parents are broke. Free candy was free candy, and that was more than enough to help me forget the beads of sweat that coated my body underneath that thick material. My night was rounding out much like my sack when I noticed Jeffrey and his goons making their rounds with the younger kids. They were not satisfied with gathering their candy. They had to have it all. I knew all too well what would happen if they knew who hid behind the face I so carefully crafted. I had to make sure to get the first hand in, so I made a quick sprint for the trees that separated my neighborhood with the next. The cluttered clumps of trees made for a good hiding spot while I worked up a plan. That potato sack did not want to fold up with how full it was, and I knew that in the dirt, ants would take my hard work, so I figured it would best be to hide in a tree. So, let me just say now that it was hard for a big boy to climb that tree, but that candy was safe in the lowest branch, despite how tired I was after getting that damn thing up there. Sweat was burning my eyes and irritating the hell out of my thighs, but I was determined to get my revenge for every spoiled All Hallows Eve. It took a few throws, but eventually a pecan landed square across Jeffrey Scott's nose. The chase was on, and it took all I could not to laugh as they followed me deeper into the woods. I weaved in and out of trees, but I knew that eventually they would catch up to me. Remember, I was the fat kid, and these were football ogres. I had to play it smart, and possibly set a trap. I had passed a few rusted-out old Fords, and I knew I could hide and squatted behind that holy heap of Detroit muscle. I tried to catch my breath and waited for the horde to bound over that last hill I had crossed getting down here. It took longer than I thought for them to catch up. The bubblicious I had shoved in my cheeks early in the night had already lost its flavor, but by that time I heard leaves rustling. It was so dark I could barely see them, but it was easy to tell their location by the flickering lights of the flashlights. The sounds of shuffling came to a stop a few yards away and were replaced by voices arguing back and forth over which way to go. They had passed me in their effort to close the gap, and now I sat behind them. It was the perfect opportunity to creep up behind them and make them pay for every piece of candy taken and every tear-soaked cotton cloth spirit costume that had ever existed. I had never been much one to hunt, but I knew that if you wanted to be quiet enough to keep from scaring off a deer, you made sure your footsteps were heel to toe and deliberate. I felt like a real monster stalking its victim, and my heart pounded in my chest with excitement. When I was sure my next action would get the best result, I gave my best rendition of a rebel yell. 3 of them ran without looking back, and Jeffrey spun on his heel, eyes wide, searching for the source of the scare. The look on his face was priceless. Mama had always told me to make sure I tied my shoes. She would go on about how one day I would trip on those things and end up in the emergency room. Well, Jeffrey Scott's mom obviously had not driven that home, because just as he came around to see my ghoulish mask, his other foot landed firm on his untied shoelace and sent him tumbling back. I had expected to see an explosion of brown and orange leaves, but instead, Jeffrey disappeared altogether. I crept closer, and as my feet came to rest just beyond where my bully once stood, I noticed the ground gave way a bit and faded into nothing shortly after. 10 feet below me lay Jeffrey Scott. He had become the new hood ornament for a decaying John Deere. The boy in the tractor laid lifeless. The scene was almost poetic, really, but at that time my 11-year-old mind could not properly possess it. It was not long after I found myself sobbing in my mother's arms. I had removed my mask early that night, and had not the will to pull on that happy sunshine one that should have replaced it. Mama fought for a good 30 minutes trying to understand the hobbled-up rambling of a story I tried to tell. I think I apologized more times that night than I have since, and she had almost pieced it all together when my father stumbled in with a Bud Light in hand. She pulled him into the kitchen, and I listened to a hushed rendition of what I had tried to tell her earlier. They both returned shortly after, my father seeming a bit sobered up suddenly from the news. He finished off his drink, crushed the can, and sat out in my pawpaws. The 2 of them made another trip to the tool shed and emerged with a shovel in each hand. I did not have to watch to see in which direction they were headed. Meanwhile, my mother dried my tears and ran me a bath. She told me that she would be back shortly to get me in bed. I heard her lift the receiver on the phone in the kitchen. She gave her brother a call. He was just Uncle Dave to me, but the rest of the town knew him as Sheriff McDougal. It took a long time for me to get to sleep that night, but the next morning my potato sack full of candy was waiting for me at the end of my bed. Mama did not make me go to school the next day, and Daddy offered to take me fishing. He never did that. I was not up for the trip, though. I stayed in bed most of the day, chewing on Tootsie Rolls and Smarties. When I did go back to school, I got a fair amount of looks, but no one said a word to me. Jeffrey's seat sat empty. Mrs. Reynolds was wiping a tear from her eye as she entered. She did not call out the missing child's name during roll call. Some of the kids were whispering about the flu going around and Jeffrey being at home sick, but that bit of gossip only lasted the first week. The missing child posters came next. Mr. and Mrs. Scott came by the house a few times, and Mama offered them sweet tea. Dad handed Dale a beer, and it was odd watching them act as nothing had happened at all. Mr. Scott cried a bit. That tugged at me somewhere deep in my stomach, but I dared not say anything. Daddy gave me that look he always had after a few too many cans of Budweiser. I still cannot make sense of why the two of them did what they did, but what everyone in town actually knew, or why no one ever asked me if I saw Jeffrey Scott. What I did learn that Halloween was two very important things. First, there is a deep gully in the woods behind my neighborhood, a place where Uncle Dave made sure no one searched those days following Halloween. Secondly, you should never threaten a Southern mama's baby boy.